You get nothing! Do you hear me? Nothing! You married into this family. You didn't build it.
Mrs. Ashford Cole, I'd sit back down. We haven't reached page 3 yet.
The conference room on the 40th floor of Ashford Tower smelled like old money and fresh hostility. Darius Cole sat at the far end of a long walnut table, hands folded, jacket buttoned, saying nothing. Across from him, Vivian Ashford Cole was already on her feet, her chair scraping backward hard enough to leave a mark on the hardwood. "You get nothing!" she screamed, snatching the thin leather folder off the table before the attorney could stop her. "Do you hear me? Nothing! You married into this family, you didn't build it!" The room went silent. Edmund Ashford's longtime housekeeper, Rosa, pressed a tissue to her mouth. 2 Ashford Infrastructure Board members exchanged a look. Vivian's brother-in-law from her mother's side, half invited out of politeness, actually stood up like he expected a fight. Darius didn't move. He'd been mocked in rooms like this before. Smaller rooms, meaner rooms, and he'd learned a long time ago that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one who ends up controlling it. Attorney Calvin Rhodes cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and set one hand flat on the folder Vivian was still gripping. "Miss S. Ashford Cole," Rhodes said quietly, "I'd sit back down. We haven't reached page 3 yet." That single sentence would end up changing everything. Who controlled a $400 million infrastructure company, who kept their name on the door, and who walked out of that room with nothing at all. But to understand how we got to that moment, let me take you back to where it started. Darius grew up in the east side of a mid-sized Ohio steel town, in a house his grandmother rented with a leaking roof and a space heater that only worked in one room. His father worked 2 jobs and was rarely home. His mother cleaned offices downtown, coming home smelling like industrial floor wax and exhaustion. Darius was 12 the first time a teacher told him in front of the class that boys like him usually don't make it to community college, let alone a real one. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He went home, wrote the comment down on an index card, and taped it inside his closet door where he'd see it every morning getting dressed. He kept that habit for 15 years. Every insult became fuel, written down, filed away, never repeated back to anyone, just absorbed and converted into work. He worked through community college doing overnight shifts at a warehouse, transferred to a state university on a partial scholarship, and graduated with a degree in civil engineering and a minor in finance that nobody in his family understood the value of yet. He took an entry-level job at a regional infrastructure firm, the kind that built bridges and water systems nobody thought about until they failed. By 29, Darius had started his own small consulting firm, Cole Structural Partners, specializing in turning around distressed infrastructure projects that bigger firms had written off as unsalvageable. He was good at 2 things: reading a balance sheet nobody else wanted to read closely, and staying quiet in rooms full of people who underestimated him. He never advertised his net worth. He drove a 6-year-old truck. He wore the same 3 suits on rotation. People who met him assumed he was middle management at best. That included, for a long time, the woman he'd eventually marry. Vivian Ashford was the only daughter of Edmund Ashford, founder and chairman of Ashford Infrastructure, a company that had quietly dominated regional water and transit contracts for 3 decades. She grew up in a house with a circular driveway and a housekeeper who'd worked there longer than Vivian had been alive. Vivian had never had to build anything. She'd been given a junior title at her father's company at 24, Director of Community Relations, a role that mostly involved hosting galas and appearing in the company newsletter, and she assumed, the way people who've never had to fight for anything often do, that competence and inheritance were the same thing. She wasn't cruel by nature so much as incurious. She had simply never been forced to ask hard questions about money, status, or where either one came from. Her father's company was a fact of the universe like weather. It would always be there, and it would always be eventually hers. When Vivian met Darius at an industry mixer 11 years ago, she found him quiet, a little unpolished around the edges of small talk, but stable, and stability was, at that point in her life, something she wanted. She never once asked to see his firm's books. She never asked what structural consulting actually meant in dollar terms. She assumed, and kept assuming for 11 years. Her father, Edmund, was not so incurious. Edmund had built Ashford Infrastructure from a 2-truck excavation outfit into a company with government contracts across 4 states. And he had a founder's instinct for spotting people who did real work versus people who performed having done real work. He watched his son-in-law for years, quietly, the way he watched everything. What Vivian never knew, what nobody but Darius and Edmund knew, was that 7 years into the marriage, Ashford Infrastructure had nearly collapsed. A failed municipal contract, a lawsuit, and a liquidity crunch had put the company 90 days from insolvency. Edmund, too proud to go to the banks and reveal how bad it was, had gone instead to the one person he trusted to keep his mouth shut, his son-in-law. Darius had quietly restructured 2 of his own consulting contracts, personally guaranteed an emergency credit line through Cole Structural Partners, and spent 4 months, unpaid, uncredited, and unmentioned to Vivian, rebuilding Ashford Infrastructure's finances from the inside. During those 4 months, Darius worked from a rented office 2 floors below Ashford Infrastructure's headquarters, so no one on staff would recognize his car in the executive garage. He reviewed contracts at 2 in the morning after full days running his own firm. He personally called 3 vendors Ashford owed money to and negotiated extended terms using nothing but his own firm's credit history as collateral, because Cole Structural Partners' name still meant something in rooms Ashford's name had started to lose credibility in. He never told a single employee at Ashford who he really was to the company. Most of them assumed he was an outside auditor Edmund had quietly brought in. He asked for nothing in return. He didn't even tell Edmund he expected anything. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever loved someone with a truly pure heart, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss these amazing stories. Why would you do this and not take a title, not take equity, nothing? Edmund had asked him once, late at night in his study, genuinely bewildered. Darius had shrugged. Because Vivian would never forgive me for saving something she thinks I couldn't have built myself. I don't need the credit. I need her father's company to survive so she doesn't lose the only home she's ever known. Edmund never forgot that answer. He wrote it down, the same way Darius wrote down insults on index cards 15 years earlier. Except Edmund's note went into something much more permanent, the estate plan he began quietly redrafting the following year. Edmund Ashford died on a Tuesday in early spring, 18 months after that late-night conversation in his study. The funeral was large, catered, and full of people who had done business with him, and almost none who had actually known him. Vivian wore black Chanel and accepted condolences like a woman already rehearsing the role of chairwoman. She had, in the weeks before the funeral, already begun referring to Ashford Infrastructure in conversation as my company. She'd started interviewing new marketing directors. She'd started quietly talking to a man named Blake Harlan, a private equity associate she'd known for 2 years, someone who specialized in unlocking value from family-held infrastructure assets, which was a polite way of saying breaking them apart and selling the pieces. Darius noticed the calls. He noticed Blake's name on her phone screen more than once, angled just slightly away from him. He said nothing. He had learned across 11 years of marriage that Vivian's moods moved faster when unopposed and slower when challenged, and grief, real or performed, was not a hill he intended to die on 2 weeks after burying her father. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday in the same 40th floor conference room where Edmund had once run board meetings. Calvin Rhodes, Edmund's longtime personal attorney, had requested that both Vivian and Darius attend in person, along with 2 independent board members as witnesses. Vivian arrived 20 minutes early, already dressed like she was accepting an award. She'd invited her cousin and her mother's side of the family, more witnesses than Rhodes had asked for, which should have told everyone in the room exactly what kind of afternoon this was going to be. "This is a formality," she told Darius in the elevator, adjusting her earring, not quite looking at him. "You know that, right? Daddy's will isn't complicated. Everything transfers to me. I just need you here because, well, technically you're still my husband for now." Darius said nothing. He'd learned that too. Rhodes opened the meeting reading through standard boilerplate, personal effects, minor bequests to Rosa and 2 longtime employees, a donation to Edmund's alma mater. Vivian's leg bounced under the table with barely restrained impatience. Then Rhodes reached the section on Ashford Infrastructure's controlling shares and the family trust. The remaining 81% of voting shares in Ashford Infrastructure, Rhodes read, held in the Ashford Family Trust are to be, to me, Vivian said, before he'd finished the sentence. Not a question, a correction. Rhodes looked up. Mrs. Ashford Cole, I need to finish the document. There's nothing to finish. I'm his daughter. I'm the only child. Just say the number and let's be done with this. She glanced toward her cousin with a small, satisfied smile, the kind reserved for people who already know how a story ends. Rhodes continued, are to be held under a 10-year voting trust, with Darius Cole named as sole trustee and controlling guardian of the trust's voting rights, effective immediately upon Edmund Ashford's death. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet right before something breaks. I'm sorry, what did you just say? Vivian's voice had dropped an octave, gone flat and dangerous. Your father transferred voting control of the trust to Mr. Cole, Rhodes said carefully. For a term of 10 years, you retain your full economic interest, dividends, distributions, but operational and voting control of Ashford Infrastructure sits with Darius during that period. Vivian's laugh came out short and humorless. That's a mistake. Calvin, that has to be a clerical error. My father would never hand his company to a man who spent the last decade doing nothing. Vivian, Darius started quietly. No. She turned on him fully now, and 11 years of small resentments, real and imagined, poured out at once, in front of her family, in front of the board, in front of Rosa, who had known Darius longer than Vivian had. No, I am done being quiet about this. You retired at 32, Darius. You've spent this entire marriage playing golf and consulting from a home office doing God knows what, living off whatever you had saved, while I actually worked, while my father actually built something. And now what? He felt sorry for you. Gave you a participation trophy on his way out. That's not what happened, Darius said, voice level. Then what happened? Her voice climbed. Explain it to me right now in front of everyone. Why my father would give a decade of control over a $400 million company to a man who has contributed literally nothing to this family except a mortgage payment and mediocre small talk at Christmas. Rosa flinched. One of the board members looked down at the table, uncomfortable. Vivian's cousin actually pulled out her phone, like she might need to remember this later. You want to know what I contributed? Darius said finally, quietly enough that the whole room had to lean in to hear it. I contributed exactly what your father asked me to contribute, nothing more. That's not an answer. Vivian's voice cracked with something closer to panic now than anger. That's the same nothing answer you've been giving me for 11 years. What did you do, Darius? What could you have possibly done that made my father hand you a decade of control over everything he built? Ask him, Darius said, nodding toward Rhodes. It's on page 3. I'm asking you. And I'm telling you the same thing I've told you every time you've asked me what I do all day in that home office, Darius said, still not raising his voice. You never wanted the real answer before. I don't think today's the day you actually want it either. You want an answer that makes you right. The board member closest to Vivian's cousin actually let out a small, involuntary breath, the sound of someone watching a fight they weren't sure was allowed to enjoy. Vivian, this isn't the room for this, Rhodes said. It's exactly the room for this. She stood, chair scraping. You get nothing, Darius. Do you hear me? I don't care what page 3 says. This marriage is over. I want a divorce, effective today, and I will fight you in court for every share of that trust if I have to. You are not running my father's company. You are not entitled to a single thing that man built. She reached across the table and snatched the folder out from under Rhodes's hand, flipping through it with shaking fingers like she could will the words into changing. Darius sat with his hands still folded. He didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. He let her finish. All of it. The way he'd let every insult finish since he was 12 years old, filing it away instead of fighting back in the moment. "Are you finished?" Rhodes asked her, not unkindly, once the room had gone silent again. Vivian, breathing hard, didn't answer. "Because we haven't reached page 3 yet," Rhodes said. "And I'd strongly suggest you sit back down before you say anything else in front of witnesses." Vivian sat back down, more out of instinct than choice. Rhodes opened the folder to the 3rd page and turned it so the whole table could see the letterhead. Edmund's handwriting, notarized, dated 18 months earlier, the same week as the late-night conversation in his study. "Before I read this," Rhodes said, "I want it on record that Edmund insisted this section be read aloud in full, regardless of how the earlier sections landed. His words, not mine." He read, "To whoever is present at this reading, I know exactly what my daughter believes about her husband, because she has told me herself more than once at more than one dinner. She believes Darius married into money and stopped trying. She is wrong, and she has been wrong for years because the one person who could have corrected her, Darius, chose her comfort over his own credit. I will not make that same choice. 7 years ago, this company was 90 days from insolvency. I did not tell my daughter. I told my son-in-law because I trusted him to fix it quietly and never ask for anything. He restructured his own firm's contracts and personally guaranteed a credit line that saved 400 jobs and this company's contracts with 3 state governments. He never took a title. He never took equity. He never told Vivian because he said she would never forgive him for saving something she assumed he couldn't have built. I am not giving Darius this trust as a reward. I am giving it to him because he is the only person in this family who has proven repeatedly that he can be trusted with power he doesn't advertise having. 10 years is enough time to prove that to everyone else, the way he already proved it to me." Rhodes lowered the page. The room was dead silent now. Not the silence before something breaks, but the silence after. Vivian's cousin had stopped filming. Rosa was openly crying. One of the board members was staring at Darius like he was seeing him for the first time. "That's not," Vivian's voice cracked. "That's not possible. The company was never in trouble. I would have known. I would have—" "You wouldn't have," Darius said quietly, the first real thing he'd said in 10 minutes. That was the point. Vivian's mother, seated near the back, finally spoke up for the first time since the reading began. "Edmund never said a word to me either. Vivian, honey, if your father kept this from both of us, maybe it wasn't about you at all." "It was absolutely about me," Vivian snapped, but the certainty had drained out of her voice. She looked down at page 3 again, then at Darius, like she was seeing the last 11 years replayed at high speed and trying to find the frame where she'd missed it. "You let me say all of that, in front of everyone. You just sat there. I've been letting you say things like that for 11 years, Darius said. I stopped expecting you to take it back a long time ago." Calvin Rhodes closed the folder gently. "There's a 4th page," he said. "It's addressed specifically to Vivian. Edmund asked that I give it to her privately, not read aloud. I'd suggest we adjourn and let her read it on her own terms." Vivian didn't reach for it right away. For the first time since she'd stood up and snatched the folder off the table, she looked less like a woman defending her inheritance and more like a woman who suddenly wasn't sure what she'd actually inherited. Vivian did not accept it gracefully. She hired a litigator within the week and filed to contest the trust, alleging undue influence, diminished capacity, anything her attorneys could find a precedent for. Blake Harlan, it turned out, was more than a friendly private equity contact. Phone records later subpoenaed as part of the trust litigation showed the two of them had been discussing, for nearly 4 months before Edmund's death, a plan to take Ashford Infrastructure private and sell off its 3 most profitable transit contracts to a competitor, a move that would have gutted the company and eliminated close to 200 jobs. Edmund, it turned out, had suspected exactly this. Buried in a secondary set of estate documents, records Rhodes hadn't needed to disclose during the reading itself, only once the litigation forced discovery, were printouts of emails Edmund had quietly obtained months before his death. Blake advising Vivian on valuation strategies for liquidation scenarios, discussing which assets would be easiest to strip first, and Vivian, in one email, writing back, "As long as it happens fast before anyone can stop it." Rhodes, it turned out, had never intended those emails to surface at the reading itself. Edmund had asked him to hold them in reserve, released only if Vivian formally contested the trust, as a kind of insurance policy against exactly the accusation she ended up making, that Darius had somehow manipulated a dying man into signing away her inheritance. Edmund's instructions, handwritten on a sticky note clipped to the folder, read simply, "Only if she fights it. I'd rather she never see these at all." She fought it. The emails came out. Forensic accountants hired by Darius's own legal team cross-referenced Blake's valuation spreadsheets against Ashford's actual contract obligations and found the liquidation plan would have breached at least 2 state infrastructure agreements, exposing the company, and potentially Vivian personally, as an 81% economic beneficiary directing the sale, to regulatory penalties neither she nor Blake had accounted for. The emails became public during discovery. 2 board members resigned in protest before the litigation even reached a courtroom. A regional business journal ran the story under the headline, "Ashford Heirs Buyout Plot Exposed in Contested Will Fight," and from there it spread. Industry newsletters, local news, eventually a national business podcast that spent an entire episode dissecting what Edmund Ashford had apparently seen coming years in advance. Vivian withdrew her legal challenge 11 weeks later, quietly through her attorneys, with no public statement. The divorce, by contrast, was finalized without incident. She kept her full economic interest in the trust, as Edmund's will guaranteed, but she never set foot in Ashford Infrastructure's offices again. Darius spent the next year rebuilding what the scandal had shaken loose, reassuring nervous contractors, personally meeting with the 200 employees whose jobs had nearly been sold out from under them, restructuring the board with people who'd actually worked in infrastructure rather than people who'd simply inherited a seat at the table. Marcus Webb, his longtime business partner from Cole Structural Partners, and the one person who'd known the real story from the start, became his COO. "You could go public with all of it," Marcus told him one night after a board meeting ran late. "The whole story. What you did 7 years ago, what Edmund's letter said, all of it. You'd never have to explain yourself to anyone in this industry again." Darius shook his head. "I don't need everyone to know I was right. I needed the company to survive, and it did. That's enough." Rosa stayed on with the company through the transition, at Darius's request. She'd been the one who'd quietly told him, years earlier, which of Edmund's business associates could be trusted and which couldn't. And Darius never forgot who'd helped him when he had no formal standing to ask for help at all. When the litigation finally concluded, she was the one who told a local reporter off the record that she'd never once seen Darius raise his voice in that house. Not in 11 years, not even the day Vivian called him nothing in front of her whole family. The 200 employees whose jobs had nearly been liquidated held onto their positions. Ashford Infrastructure's transit contracts, the same ones Blake had planned to strip and sell, went on to win 2 additional state bids the following year under Darius's restructured leadership, proof to the board members who'd stayed that competence had simply been standing in the room the entire time, waiting to be asked a real question. He never gave an interview about the will reading. He never posted about the divorce. When reporters asked for comment on the Ashford family's corporate soap opera, his office issued exactly one line: "Mr. Cole is focused on Ashford Infrastructure's 400 employees, not on relitigating his personal life in public." 9 years into the 10-year trust term, Darius quietly began drafting a succession plan, not to hand voting control back to Vivian, whose economic interest remained untouched, but whose relationship to the company had permanently ended, but to convert the trust into an employee ownership structure that would outlast both of them. Edmund's test, it turned out, had never really been about who deserved the reward. It had been about who could be trusted not to need one. So here's my question for you. How many people in your own life have you underestimated just because they never advertised what they were capable of? Darius Cole spent 11 years being quietly dismissed by the one person who should have known him best, and he never once raised his voice to correct her. He let his work speak, eventually, on a page he never asked to be written. If this story hit you, drop a comment and tell me. Would you have stayed silent for 7 years like Darius did? Or would you have told her the truth the moment she started underestimating you? If you want more stories like this, quiet people, loud rooms, and the moment everything flips, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.